All right, so we've learned about HTML, including page structure, tag syntax, attributes, and more. But HTML by itself is very ugly, as you've seen. So we need CSS or cascading style sheets to make our markup or HTML look presentable. So the goal of this section is to look at the fundamental CSS properties for things like fonts, colors, alignment, positioning, etc. Now, this section after this will be creating an actual website project, but I didn't want to jump right into that, right into a full project, because I want you guys to really understand what's going on and understand what these properties are doing, rather than just jump into a website project and have you copy the code and just follow along. If you're really comfortable with basic CSS, feel free to skip around. But even if you've worked with CSS before, I think that there'll be things in this section that will still help you out, that you can still learn. So here's a list of what we'll be going over in this section. I'm going to show you how to actually implement CSS. There's a few different ways. We're going to look at basic selectors so that we can actually grab different elements, whether it's by the tag name or the ID, the class. We'll look at fonts and colors and different properties, different color types like hexadecimal, RGB. We're going to look at backgrounds and borders, including background colors, background images, box model and margin and padding. We're going to look at what the box model is, what exactly margin is, where that spacing goes, where the padding goes, floating and alignment. Okay, now there are more modern ways to align things on a page, such as Flexbox and the grid system, and we're going to get into that later on. This section is all about just core basic CSS. Okay, we're also going to be looking at the display property, so display inline, display block, inline block. We'll look at styling links and buttons, creating menus such as a horizontal navigation menu as well as a vertical menu, positioning, so relative positioning, absolute, fixed, and so on, form styling, and then we're also going to be using the Google Chrome Dev Tools quite a bit to look at the HTML and CSS, as well as like the computed CSS and stuff like that. All right, so just like with the last section, we're going to have a sandbox. So this will be the CSS sandbox, where we're going to have a different file for different aspects of the section, different aspects of CSS, and you can keep this and use it if you ever need to go back to. And these files will be included in the lecture downloads. And then after this section, we're going to start putting everything together, and we're going to build a simple hotel website. All right, so up to this point, we've only looked at HTML, which is definitely needed. We need it to actually put stuff on the page, but by itself, it's very ugly. We need CSS to style it and move things around and align and add colors and background and anything else that has to do with layout and style. So in this section, we're going to look at all the basics of CSS. So let's go ahead and create a new folder. And just like we did with HTML, we're going to create a sandbox. So I'm going to call this CSS sandbox. And these files will be in the lecture, the last lecture, the introduction, if you want to download those, or you can just create them along with me. So I'm going to open this with VS Code. So in Visual Studio Code, I'm just going to go ahead and open folder and open up CSS sandbox. And we're going to create in here a new file, and I'm going to call this we'll call it basic.01 underscore basic.html. So I'm just numbering them so you know what order we're going in. And again, you don't have to number them. And if you didn't watch the last section, the HTML section, we are using an extension called Live Server so that we can open our HTML file in a little server and it will auto reload. So you just want to install that if you don't have that yet. All right, I also went over some tips and tricks with shortcuts as well as Emmet, which allows us to write faster HTML. So we can actually do exclamation and hit enter or tab, and it'll give us this basic HTML structure. Okay, so in the title here, I'm going to call this Implementing CSS, because I want to talk about the different ways we can actually bring in CSS. And we're going to look a little bit at selectors, but we're going to talk more about that in the next video. So let's put some basic HTML in here. I'm going to put an H1 and just say heading 1, And then I'm going to copy this down by doing Shift Option or Shift Alt on a Windows machine, and then hit the down arrow twice. So this will be heading 2 and heading 3. And let's actually make this an H2. Make this an H3. Okay, and I'm going to save this, and then we're going to open with Live Server. Okay, and right now I have this, I have them both, you know, the browser and the editor on the same screen, but later on we're going to have to make this bigger if we're going to build, you know, real websites and stuff. So we have 3 headings on the screen, and I'm going to show you 3 different ways to implement CSS. The first is called inline CSS, which is not something that you want to do, but it is something you should know. And this is what we were doing in the last section, the HTML section, when I just wanted to show you a couple examples of stuff. So we use the style tag, and you can actually put CSS in here. Like, let's say we want to use the color property and we want to set that to red. If I go ahead and save that, the heading turns red. Now you don't want to do this, and the reason for that is you want to keep, it's called separation of concerns. You want to keep your styling out of your markup. Okay, you want to keep those 2 things separate, and when you do it like this, you're just clumping it all together. It's much harder to read, it's much harder to change. It's just not good practice, and any developer will give you crap for doing this. So this is not something you want to do, but it's something that you should know you can do. Alright, so next one I want to show you is called internal CSS, where it's still on the same page. It's on this HTML page, but it's separate from your HTML. The way that you do this is inside your head tag, you put in a style tag. Okay, and then in here you can just put CSS. Now, when you're using CSS, you need a way to select whatever it is you want to style. Let's say we want to change the color of this H2. Well, we can use the actual element as the selector. So I can say H2 and then open some curly braces, and I can put as many styles in here as I want. So let's say we want color, and let's add green. And if I save that, notice that it turns green. All right, now let's go over this syntax really quick. So if we take a look here, I mean, this is similar to what we just did, except we used color instead of background color. But the first thing here is a selector. In this case, it's an A tag. What we just did was we did the H1, then we did the H2. And you can use the actual tag as a selector, but you can also use IDs, classes. There's something called pseudo selectors. There's a lot of different things we can do for selectors, and we're going to get into that in the next video as well as later on. So that's the selector. Then we have the declaration start. We also have the declaration end. So everything goes within these curly braces. And inside the curly braces, we have a property, such as background color or color, as you just saw, and then the value, okay? And in between that, we have the property value separator, which is a colon. All right, so you have the property and value, and you can add more of these. If we wanted to add a color, we could do that as well. You just want to end each one with a semicolon. So this is basically just a diagram of how CSS works. So we've looked at 2 ways to add CSS: inline, which you don't want to do, and then internal. And I'm just going to put a comment here, and you can have comments in CSS as well. If I hold down Control and hit the question mark or /, you'll see that it adds in a / asterisk and ends with an asterisk /. This is a CSS comment. So in here, I'm just going to say that this is internal CSS. All right. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to show you the third way, which is external CSS, where you actually have a separate file that you bring in that has all your CSS. So let's create a folder. I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to click the folder icon and call this folder CSS. And in here, let's create a file called style.css. That's a common name for a main style sheet. And you can include more than one style sheet if you want as well. So now that we have a separate file, let's grab this H3 right here. So I'm going to use the H3 element as a selector, and I'm going to do color blue. Okay. Okay, we want to end that with a semicolon. Now, if I save this, you'll notice that the H3 is not blue, and the reason for that is this file has no clue that it's supposed to look at that style.css. We actually have to bring that in, and the way that we do that is with a link tag. Okay, HTML has a link tag that we can use in the header, so we'll say link, and then I'll hit enter or tab. And it gives us some necessary attributes such as rel. This tells it basically what type of link is this. It's for a style sheet. And then an href, just like with the a tags, this points to the location that we want to basically load, which in our case is in the folder called CSS, and it's a file called style.css. So if I save this now, you'll see that the H3 changes blue. That's because we're now including this file. Okay, if we don't have this, if I comment this file out and save, it's not going to read it. So you want to make sure that you include your style sheets. Now, out of these three, this is the preferred, okay, using an external CSS file. When we build our projects, when we create a website, all our CSS will be in a separate file. However, for this sandbox, for this section, I'm going to be doing it this way because I don't want, for a couple reasons. One reason, I don't want to have to go back and forth to go to my CSS. I also want you guys to get a big picture of what's going on, so I want you to see the HTML and the CSS at the same time. But usually you would do it this way. You would have a separate file. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So in the next video, we're going to start to look at how to use IDs and classes for selectors, how to use multiple selectors, nested selectors, things like that. So I will see you in the next video. Alright guys, so in the last video I showed you how to implement CSS in a few different ways, and the most common way is going to be by using an external style sheet like a style.css and then bringing it in using the link tag. But like I said, for the sandbox, for this section, I'm going to be using internal CSS and a style tag just so we have everything on one page, just for the sake of learning. Okay, so let's create a new file here. And we're going to call this 02_selectors.html, because what I want to talk about is the different ways that we can select content to style or select elements or tags to style. So let's put in our boilerplate here with VS Code, and let's call this CSS selectors. And we're going to put in some style tags here. Okay, and then as far as the body, I'm going to just put in some simple HTML. We'll have a div, and inside this div, let's do an H2. We'll just say welcome, and paragraph, let's do lorem 20 tab, and then let's do another div, and we'll do another H2, and we'll say about, paragraph, lorem 20 tab. Okay, so let's save this and let's open it up with Live Server, if you're using Live Server. So we have two divs with a heading and a paragraph. Now, in the last video, we took an H2 and we gave it a color. Let's go ahead and do that. We'll say green. And if I save that, what happens is it's going to take every single H2 on the page and style it green. Now, there's going to be cases where you don't want every single element, whatever that element is, to be styled. You want to pick and choose what you want to style. Like, let's say we only want this first one to be green. In that case, we would use an ID or a class. So if I were to add ID green dash heading, I could go up here and I could add on to this H2 a number sign which represents an ID and then the name of the ID, and I could have called it absolutely anything. If I save that, notice only the first one is green, okay, because it's targeting this ID. Now this is actually optional. We don't have to put the actual element. However, if we keep it off like that, we could add this green heading ID to anything and it would be in effect. If I added it to a paragraph, it would turn the paragraph color green, although that wouldn't make much sense because we called it green heading. But for the most part, you're not going to see the actual element, at least in my experience. Now, remember what I said about classes and IDs. This is not really something I would put inside of an ID because it doesn't really, for one thing, we might want to use this again. We might want another green heading somewhere. And IDs should be something that there's only one of. So I would actually change this to a class. And then to target a class, the styling is the same way. It's just this right here. Instead of a number sign, you want a dot. So if I save that, notice it's still green. Okay, so just remember, a number sign is for IDs, dot is for classes. And I'm just going to comment this stuff out just so you have some reference. And I'll do an ID and I'll add that as well later on. So now what I want to do is talk a little bit about naming conventions. This is not really a good name because at any point we might want to change this to a different color like blue. Maybe it's a website for a company and they change their branding. So if I save that, it's now blue. In this heading, or I'm sorry, this title here, the class name, makes no sense. So what I would do is I'd call this something like primary heading instead of green heading. Okay, that way it's just your primary color, your heading's primary color. You might even have a secondary heading class if you want a different color. And it doesn't have to just be color. You could change the font size, whatever it is that you want. But you want to think about your naming conventions, okay? And you want to think about the future. Could this change in the future? So calling it green heading is not really a good choice, even though it's going to work. It's not a smart choice semantically. All right, so now what I want to do is, let's add an ID to these divs. So we'll call this one welcome, and let's call this one about. Okay, so you see how this makes sense because we're not going to have another welcome div or another about div. So an ID is a good choice for this. So if I wanted to, let's say give the welcome ID a background color, I could target it like this, right? And I'll say background or background color. And don't worry about any of these properties. I don't want you to focus on these because we're going to talk about all of these later. I want you to focus on the selectors. So I'm going to give this a background color of a hexadecimal value that's actually a light gray. So if I save that, notice that this only has that background color. So let me put a comment here and say the number sign is for IDs. Now, what if I want to have some styling, but I want it for both of these divs right here? Okay, so if we want to do that, we can use multiple selectors. So what I'll do is I'll take the welcome, okay, the div with the ID of welcome, put a comma, and then put the div with the ID of about, and then put my styling. So let's say I want to give them a border of 1 pixel solid. We'll do, I don't know, light gray. And I'm going to talk about these numbers probably in the next video or the one after that. And then I also want to add a little bit of padding and margin bottom of 5 pixels. All right, so I'm going to save that, and that style was now it was applied to both of these divs because I used multiple selectors, and I could add more if I want. It doesn't have to be IDs. I could put an H2, I could put a paragraph, I could put a class, whatever I want, and that would take on all of these styles in here. Okay, now let's say I wanted to target a specific, for instance, a specific paragraph inside of a specific div. Like, let's say the welcome paragraph, I want that font size to be bigger. What I could do is I could use a nested selector by saying ID welcome and then space paragraph. Okay, you don't want to do a comma. What that means is it means all the divs or all the elements with the ID of welcome in all paragraphs. You don't want that comma because we want to say inside the element of welcome, we want the paragraph inside of it. Okay, and then let's say font size, we'll do 20 pixels. By the way, 16 is the default, but I'll talk about pixels and all that in a little bit. So if I save that, notice that only the welcome div paragraph has the font size of 20. All right, so let's see what else. We can also style the body. So if we go up here, let's say body styling. So we'll take body, and body is usually where you put, like, if you want the whole website or the whole web page to have a background color, you could do that. I'm going to give it a hexadecimal of 333, which is a dark gray. So if I save that, you'll see it changes the whole body. Now the reason we can't read this right here is because by default the text is black. So what I'll do is I'll just target the about, okay, the div with about, and I'll change the color, which is the text color, to white so that we can see it. Okay, and I know this is pretty ugly looking, but I just want you to know the different types of ways to basically select and style different elements. Okay, so instead of body styling, I'm just going to say element selector. Okay, because we're grabbing the actual element or the actual tag. When I say element, I just mean tag. The body itself is the element, div is the element, h2 is the element, with the angle brackets is a tag. So I use them interchangeably. All right, so we have Elementor selectors. Let's just make this consistent here. Element selectors. Dot is for classes. Number is for IDs. We have multiple selectors by using a comma. We have nested selectors, so we can select stuff inside of other elements. And that's pretty much the basics. I mean, we have other things like pseudo selectors and stuff like that, but I'm not going to get into that now. I just want you to understand the fundamentals of selecting elements and being able to style them. All right, so that's it, guys. I will see you in the next video. All right, so before we get into CSS properties and stuff like that, I want to take a break from VS Code and just go into Google and take a look at the dev tools. Now, if you're not using Google, if you're using Firefox or Safari, those also have developer tools, and they can do all the stuff we're going to do in this video. You just might have to look up the shortcut to get to them, or the menu item to get to them. So in Chrome, if you're on Windows, you can hit F12. That should open them. If you're on a Mac, you can do Option Command I, and that will also open them. And it's also in the menu, so if you go up here and you go to more tools, I know you guys can't see it, but off to the right there's a developer tools option, and I can click that, and that will also open them up. So there's a lot of tabs here, and they're very powerful. We can see network connections, we have a JavaScript console, there's all types of stuff we can do here. But what we want to focus on is the Elements tab. And what this does is it shows us all the HTML and CSS for the page. And by the way, if you want to make this bigger or smaller, you can hit Control plus to make it bigger, or Control minus to make it smaller. Also, if you want it to dock on the side, you could go like that, or the other side, or you could even undock it. This will undock it and put it in a separate window. I usually like to have it on the bottom. But anyways, this is the HTML over here. This is the CSS. Now notice when I hover over something like the body, it actually highlights everything that's in the body. If I hover over the div with the ID of welcome, it hovers over that. Okay, if I uncollapse this and I go over the H2, the paragraph, so whatever I hover over, it's going to highlight in the browser. And then if we want to select something, we can go ahead and hit the select tool. See how it turned blue? And then let's say I want to look at the HTML and CSS for this welcome, this H2 right here. I can click that, and notice that it's now highlighted down here, and it also shows me the CSS. So it shows me the H2 CSS and the class of primary heading, because that's a class that's actually on this element. Now, we didn't put any of this H2 stuff in here. The font size, display block, there's some margin here, font weight bold. This is default browser styling. Okay, every browser has default styling. For the most part, it's pretty much the same. And the way that we can tell this is from the browser is right here, user agent style sheet. Okay, by user agent, it basically means the browser that you're using. This styling is coming from our selectors HTML file. Now, usually this will be a CSS file because, like I said, usually we use external CSS files, and you'll see that when we start getting into projects. But it's just going to give us whatever the file name this CSS is located in. All right, now we can actually change stuff here too temporarily. So this welcome text right here, if I wanted to change this to, let's say, hello, and then click somewhere else, you'll see the text actually changes. I can also, I can change this if I want to, I don't know, other class, and now you'll see that it's no longer blue because it doesn't have the primary heading class. The primary heading is where that blue came from. Okay, now what's cool is you can do this with any site. Like if we go to google.com and we open up our tools here, and what I want to do is click the select icon and then this button right here. So this is actually an input. It has the type of submit. Remember we learned about this stuff in the last section, and the value is I'm feeling lucky. So if I double click this, I can change this to whatever. Let's say I'm feeling awesome, and you might want to have some fun with this. And notice that it's changed now in the browser. Now it hasn't changed on Google's servers so other people can see it. It's only locally to our browser. And if we reload the page, it goes back to normal. So if we wanted to change some CSS, let's go up here and let's click on the body. That gives us the CSS of the body. Let's say we wanted to change the background here, which is white. This is hexadecimal for white. Let's change it to red. So now we have a red body. We can change the color here to white. And notice the text up here is not white because this has its own styling. So if I click the select tool and let's click one of these links right here, notice the color is black. So I'm going to select that and change it to white, and now these links are white. Okay, so you can really have some fun here. You could replace the image link if you want. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. But yeah, see, now it goes back to normal. But you could change a whole bunch of stuff. You can add content, and it's only local to your machine. No one else sees it, obviously. That would the internet would be a crazy place if you could just edit anyone's site. But it is kind of fun to mess with, and you can learn a lot from doing stuff like that. All right, so I just wanted to kind of introduce you to the Chrome tools, the developer tools. And we will be using these more as we go along in the course. So in the next video, we're going to start to look at fonts. I want to look at different font families. I want to talk about web-safe fonts, and we'll also look at colors. All right, so I'll see you in the next video. All right, guys, in this video, we're going to look at fonts, specifically the font family property and font size property. So you might want to use different styles of fonts in different websites and different user interfaces. So we're going to take a look at how to do that. We're going to talk about web-safe fonts and also how to use fonts from other sources like Google Fonts. So let's create a new file here called 03_fonts.html. And we're going to put our boilerplate in here. And let's go down and just change the title to fonts. And let's put our style tags in here for our CSS. And then I'm going to copy from the last file, the selectors, just the two divs that are in the HTML here, just so we can use them as a text display. So I'm going to save this and then open with Live Server. And let's make it a little bigger. I'll hold Control and hit the plus symbol and just make these a little bigger. All right. So in our style right here, let's add a selector for the body. That's usually where you're going to add your font family because then it affects your whole page, right? So the fonts for your whole page. So we want to use font-family, which takes in a font stack. So basically a list of different fonts, and in VS Code we get this cool drop down so we can of font stacks that we can choose from. But before we get into that, I want to take a look at web-safe fonts. Now, you have the ability to use pretty much any font that you want that you can get your hands on, but if they're not these web-safe fonts, then you're going to want to include the actual font files within your website, just like you would include a CSS file. And you can also link to them remotely, which I'm going to show you how to do with Google Fonts. But these right here, you don't need to do anything extra for, because they're gonna be available in all browsers that users are using to view your website with. And notice that there's some of these, there's multiple fonts. These are actually called font stacks. For instance, this first one, Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif. What's going to happen is it's going to look for the Arial font to use. If it can't find that, it'll move to use Helvetica. If it can't find that, it'll use any sans serif font. So basically you have sans serif and serif, and this is an example of what these look like. So basically a serif font has these edges, these points on the edge, and a sans serif font is like a flat look. For the most part, you're probably going to want to use a sans serif font because they just look neater. They also look much more modern, and part of the reason for that is because Times New Roman, which is a very serif font, is the default. Okay, so when we don't add a font family, that's what's used. Some of my favorite website fonts are Arial. I also like Verdana. I like Tahoma. So let's jump back into VS Code and Chrome. And by default, like I said, it's using sans serif. You can see the kind of like the point. See the A right here. So I want to change this to Arial. Now in VS Code, if I just type in A, Arial Helvetica Sans Serif is actually an option. Okay, so this is a font stack. Like I said, it's going to look for Arial, then Helvetica Sans Serif. If I save this, notice how it changes into a flatter looking font. Okay, let's try something else. Let's try Verdana. So we'll if I just put a V in there, Verdana is gonna pop up. So we have Verdana, Geneva, Tahoma, Sans Serif. Save it. It's a little different, but it's still a sans serif font. Okay, so if you want to use something different, something that isn't in that list I showed you, then what I would recommend is using Google Fonts. So I'm going to open up a new browser here and just make it bigger. And let's head over to fonts.google.com. So here you can go over to the search. You can search for certain fonts. You can browse them if you want. You can see samples of them. I like Roboto. That's one I use quite a bit. And you'll see it pops up over here. There's Roboto, Roboto Condensed, Roboto Mono, Slab. So let's say we want to use this Roboto font. We can click this plus sign right here, and we get this little pop-up. And if I click on that, it shows us how we can bring this into our HTML. We can do it using a link tag, just like we do with just regular CSS files. We can also import it into our CSS like this. Usually I do import it, but since we're putting our CSS in the HTML file, I'm just going to use the link. Okay, so if we grab that, and then it shows us how we can actually implement it, we can just add the font family and then Roboto Sans Serif. So let's go back into VS Code, and let's open up our other browser here. And let's go right below actually we'll go right above the title and paste in that link. Okay, so it links to fontsgoogleapis.com/CSS, and then as a parameter it has family equals Roboto. So now we should be able to go ahead and put in Roboto, just like it said, and then sans serif. And if I save it, there we go. And that looks pretty nice and clean. I really like the Roboto font. So that's how we can use basically non-web safe fonts. Okay, so next thing I want to look at is font size. Okay, so let's say font size. Now the standard is 16 pixels, and that's actually on the HTML tag. Okay, the HTML tag by default has a font size of 16 pixels. That's what you're seeing. That we do have this zoomed in a little bit. That's why it's bigger. Actually, let's put it back to just let's put it back to just 100%. So I'm going to do Control and then the minus. And that's 110, that's 100, so that's the default. So let's change it to 18 pixels. Okay, and for the most part, I usually leave it at 16, but just to show you, I'll change it to 18 and save, and now you can see it's bigger. Also, we can adjust the line height, which is basically the height of each line. So let's say line dash height. And this is usually in M units, which is a relative unit, and I'm going to go over rem and M units later on, so don't worry if you don't really understand this. But a common value I like to use for the line height for the body is 1.6 M. And we'll save, and notice how now there's more space in between each line. Okay, so I think it makes it look a little cleaner. Now, I want to talk a little bit about units, so pixels, M, and so on. Now, looking at this list of CSS units, this one, which is absolute units, and then we also have relative units, it may be a little overwhelming, but don't worry about it because we don't use most of these. In fact, the only thing we're going to use on this page is pixels. Pixels is the common absolute unit that you're going to use. You can use centimeters, you can use millimeters, inches. You can set your font to 1 inch if you want, but that's not something that you're probably going to do. What you're going to use is pixels, and the exact size of 1 pixel is 1/96 of 1 inch. Okay, there's also points. Points may be familiar from something like Microsoft Word, and 1 point is 1/72 of 1 inch. You may run into points, but for the most part, you're going to see pixels. You also have picas, which it's actually equal to 12 points. Okay, you're not going to really see that. Now, there's also something called relative units, which I'm going to get into later. I'm not going to really focus on this right now. But for instance, you have percentage. You can set it to percentage of a parent element. And by the way, this doesn't have to be just font size. This could be for margin, padding, line height, what else? Width, height, all that stuff. Okay, so you also have M and rem units. M is basically it's a multiplier, so whatever the size of your parent element, let's say the parent div to a paragraph is 16 pixels, and you set it to 1M, that's going to be equal to 16 pixels. If you set it to 1.2M, that'll be equal to 16 pixels times 1.2. Rem units act the same way, except instead of the parent element, they use the root HTML element, which by default is 16 pixels. So if you set it to 1 rem, by default it'll be set to 16 pixels. And if this is confusing the crap out of you, don't worry, we're going to get into this stuff later. I'm not even going to bother going over viewport width and viewport height right now. Alright, so let's head back into VS Code. And I'm actually going to put the font family back to Arial, or Arial Helvetica Sans Serif. And I just want to show you a couple more font properties. So I want to look at font weight and font style, which are very simple. They're basically used to make some text bold or make text italic. So I'm going to add a span in here. So let's say span. I'm going to take the ending tag here, Control-C, copy it, delete it, and then put that there. And also put a span down here. Oops. Let's do span. And we'll take the ending tag, put that down here. Alright, so let's save that. Let's go up here. And I want to show you how to target these spans. So for this one here, we can say we want to go into the welcome div. Okay, so the div has the ID of welcome. And then we want to go into the paragraph, and then we want to go into that span. So that's how we can target this first span right here. Now technically we don't even need the paragraph because it's still going to look into this div with the ID of welcome and then onto this span, but I think it's more organized to keep the paragraph in there, okay, just as an extra step. And let's say we want to make the font weight bold. And notice that this VS Code gives us the selections, which we could use numbers to make them more or less bold, but we're just going to choose bold and save, and notice how now the span, the text that's within the span is bold. Okay, so just like the strong tag, we can set it to bold through CSS. So let's target this span down here by saying we want the about div paragraph span, and we're going to set the font style to italic and save, and now you can see it's very faint, but this text is now italic. So these are the font based properties. In the next video, I want to start to get into colors, and you saw that I used, for instance, the color name like red and green. I also use this weird this number sign and then some letters. That's actually called hexadecimal. We also have something called RGB. So I want to look at colors and the different types that we can use in CSS. Alright, so in this video I want to quickly talk about the different color types that are commonly used. Now I'm not going to go over all of them, but I'm going to go over the ones that you'll see for the most part, the most common types. So let's create a file called 04_colors.html, and let's put our boilerplate in here, and we'll go ahead and change the title to colors. Let's add in our style tags, and as far as the body, let's just put a couple headings. Let's do an H2 here, and an H3, and then up in the style I'm going to grab the H1 as a selector and give it a color property, which is going to be the color of the text. Okay, now as far as colors go, anything I'm going to show you, you can use for the color property. You can also use for the background color. You can also use for a border, anything. And the first type is a name, so we can put like red in here. So let's save this and let's run it with via live server. So open that up, and of course we have a red heading. So this is a color name. Now, in addition to the common colors like red, blue, green, we have a bunch of not so common colors, like for instance coral. If I save that, you can see we get coral. And in VS Code, if I just put any letter in, like a G, it's going to show us all the different options for the different color names. If I put an A, you see all these different colors. We have aqua, aquamarine, azure, B, all these, beige, blue, violet, burlywood, some really weird names. But anyways, these are colored names. So the second color type that we can use is an RGB value. So for the H2, let's say RGB. And this takes in three values, red, green, and blue. And each value should be anywhere between 0 and 255. So if I do 0, that means that the value for red is 0. Okay, let's do green 0 and blue 0. And if I save that, it's going to be black because we have no presence of red, green, or blue. Now the highest you can go is 255. So if I say 255 for the first one here, and in VS Code it even gives us a little preview here, which is nice. But if I save that, we get red. Okay, now if I wanted it slightly darker, I could do like, I don't know, 210. You can see now it's darker. And let's say I wanted to do all blue. I could go to the last one here. 255 is the highest, and it's as blue as it can get, really. Now, there's a lot of different color combinations, obviously. It can be anything between 0 and 255 for all of these. So if I do, like, let's say 100 of green and maybe, I don't know, 20 of red and save, we get this blue color. Let's tone this down a bit. We'll say like 120 and save, and we get this color, which is like a grayish blue, and it gives you a little preview right here. So just remember that all zeros is black, and then if you do all 255s, take a crack at what that's going to give us. If all zeros are black, then all 255s are going to be white, as you can see, and you can't even read it because the background's white, but as you can see, it is there. So that's red, green, blue, or RGB. Now the third type is the most common and the one that we'll be using the most, and that's hexadecimal, or hex, which is a base 16 number, and it pertains to the composition of a certain color in the RGB space. So it's always going to start with a number sign, and it's going to be 6 or 3 characters that are going to be letters and or numbers. For numbers, it's going to be either 0 to 9, or for letters, it'll be A to F. So all zeros is going to be black, and then all Fs is going to be white. Now, just like RGB, we have red, green, blue. In hexadecimal, we have red, the first two, green the second two, and blue the last two. So if I wanted red, I could do FF for red for the first two, and then 0, 0 green, 0, 0 blue, and that gives me red. Okay, if I wanted blue, I'd put F for the last two, like that. And if I did FF in just the middle, it'll be green, and then any combination of any of those. So just like RGB, it's going to give us just a color based off of the values of red, green, and blue. Now, obviously, you're not going to remember all these different hex codes. You may have some preferred colors that you use often that you'll remember, but there's plenty of websites and software that you can use to reference different colors, and I'm going to give you an example in a minute. But what you do want to remember is obviously black, which is all zeros. Now, when you have a hex value that's all the same, you can actually cut it down to 3. So 3 zeros is black and 3 F's is white. Okay, you want to remember that. And then anything else that's going to be all the same, like let's say 3 D's or 3 C's, it's going to be a shade of gray because all the red, green, and blue values are the same. Same thing if we do like F4 3 times. That's going to be some shade of gray. If we do E3, that'll be a shade of gray. As you can see, it's very light. So some common ones that I use are 333, which is almost black. It's a really dark gray. I think it's cleaner than using jet black, so I use it a lot for backgrounds. If I want a light background, a lot of times I use F4, like that. So those are just some of the ones that I keep in mind. As far as colors, like different blues or reds and stuff, I'll use a reference like this website here. This is color-hex.com. So we just have a palette here of different colors. These are just the latest favorite colors. But we can go up here and we can use the color palette. But if I click one of these, like let's say this is blue right here. Let's say we're building an application or a website and we like this blue. If I click on that, it shows us the hexadecimal, the RGB value, and then other color types as well that I didn't talk about, like HSL, HSV. And you can use these in CSS, but I don't, and they're not that common. Also, what's cool about this site is if you go down, you have a palette of different shades, okay, different shades and tints that have to do with this hexadecimal value, because often you're going to want a color palette or a color scheme in your website or your application with colors that relate to each other. So you might have, buttons that have this color and maybe your background has this color or something like that. And then down here you can see the percentages of RGB. So this gives you a lot of information on different colors. It gives you examples in CSS. So really, really helpful site. I would definitely bookmark this site. Another good one is htmlcolorcodes.com. And this one here, you can see we have a color palette. We can just kind of slide and it gives us the hex value, the RGB, the HSL. So this is a pretty cool site as well. Down here we have a color chart. We can click and it shows us in the header the different values. All right, so you'll learn more as we go along, but I just wanted you to understand these 3 different types of colors that we can use in CSS. And of course, you can use color names. I prefer hex. Like if I have to make something white or black, I'll use the hex value. A lot of people have asked me why. Why don't I just use white or black? But I like to be consistent. I don't like to have color names mixed with hex values. It's just it's just my thing. But you can do it any way you want. So just keep that in mind. Everyone's different. Everyone does things differently. All right, guys. So that's it for this one, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, guys. In this video, we're going to talk about backgrounds and borders, and I'm going to use the full screen editor and full screen browser because I want to utilize all the space here. Now, notice that I have a folder called IMG. This is an image folder, and I have 2 images. One is a stars.jpg file, which is this image here. I'm going to use as a background. And then I have a leaf.png, which you can't really see because it's transparent and it's on a dark background. Now, one thing to remember is JPEG files or JPEG images, they can't be transparent, okay, like this one is. PNG files can have a transparent background where you can put it on any web page. Like let's say the web page is a red background and it will show red behind this image. If it were a JPEG, it would have to have a solid color. It couldn't be transparent. So just remember that. If you want transparency, then use a PNG image. All right, so what we're going to do now is create a file called 05_backgrounds_borders.html. And let's put in our boilerplate here. And for a title, we'll say backgrounds and borders. Let's add in our style tags. And as far as the HTML goes, we're going to have 4 divs. So the first one is going to have an ID of box-1. Okay, so you want a div with the ID of box1. We're going to put in H3 and just say box1 for the title. And we want a paragraph with, let's say, 20 words. So we'll do lorem 20. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is just highlight this whole div, and I'm going to copy it down with Shift Option or Shift Alt on Windows, and then we're going to hit the down key 3 times. So now we have 4 divs, and then we're just going to change the ID. So 1, 2, and 3, and 4. And then we'll change the text as well. And we'll probably use this HTML in a couple different lectures. That's 3 and 4. Okay, so let's save this and let's open it up with Live Server. And it should look like this. Okay, so we have our 4 divs. And we're going to style the first one. So let's go back and let's target the ID of box1, and we're going to use the background. Oops, if I spell background right. We want to use the background color property. Now, when you want to assign a color to text, obviously we use the color property. We've already talked about that. If you want to style the background or color the background, you use background color. And I'm just going to choose this Blanche Almond. Doesn't really matter what color we use. But if I go ahead and save this and we take a look, notice that this whole div now has that background color. Okay, and it's going to take up however much space that the element takes up, or the div. And remember, divs are block level, so this is going to go all the way across by default. Okay, unless we set a width on it or something like that. And I know the text is right up against the edge. That's because there's no padding. I'm going to go over margin and padding in a lecture very soon. So let's head back into our editor here, and I want to go over border. Okay, now border has 3 mandatory properties. So the first one is going to be width, and this can be in any order, but we're going to do width first. So let's say 3 pixels. Now if I just do that and take a look, we have nothing. There's no change because we need all 3 properties. The next one is going to be the color. So we want to say border dash color, and let's just do red. And then the last one is going to be border style, which can be dashed, dotted, double, groove. The most popular is going to be solid. That's probably the most common that you'll use, which is just a solid regular border. So let's save that and let's take a look. And now we have a 3 pixel wide red solid border. Okay, and just to give you an idea of some of the other styles, we can do like dotted. If we take a look at that, that's the dotted border. And what else? We have dashed. That's dashed. It's similar to dotted, but they're wider lines. But for the most part, you're probably going to be using solid the most. Now, using all 3 properties like this, we don't have to do it this way, and this isn't the preferred way. What we can do is just use the single border property, and we can actually add all 3 of those in here. So 3 pixels, solid red, and it doesn't matter the order either. You can use any order. And if I comment this out, I'll highlight this and do control / or control question mark. That'll comment that out. If I save with control S and take a look, we have the same thing. Okay, so this is the exact same as doing this. It's just less lines of code. Okay, so that's border. Let's say we want to do just a border on the top. Actually, you know what? We'll grab the next one. Let's do box 2. And let's actually give this a background. Now we can also use just background if we want to add a color or a background image, which I'll get into in a second. But let's give this a dark background, and let's give it a color, a text color of white. Oops. And let's say we just want a border on the top. We can just do border dash top, and let's say we want to do blue solid 3 pixels. Okay, so if we save that and we take a look, now we just have a border on the top. So you can do border top, border bottom, border left, and border right. All right, so now I want to take a look at the border radius property, because by default our corners are just straight corners, but we can round it off if we want. So I'm actually going to comment out the border top, or no, I'll leave it. But what I do want to do, is just add a line break between these two, box 1 and box 2. There we go. So let's say that this top one here, I want rounded corners. So for that, I would use a border radius. So I'm going to go to box 1, and I'm going to say border radius. And we can put percentages here. We can put pixels. Let's say 10 pixels. That's pretty common. And if we take a look, now we have rounded corners. Now before CSS3, there was no border radius property. We actually had to create little images of corners, rounded corners, and then position them perfectly so that it looked rounded like that, which was a huge pain in the butt. And if you're just learning HTML and CSS now, you missed a lot of crappy stuff that we used to have to do before HTML5 and CSS3. Just to let you know that. Now, if we wanted to just add rounded corners to, like, let's say the top, we can do that as well. So let's take box 2 and let's say border dash top dash left dash radius. I know that's a long property. And let's say 10 pixels. So if we take a look at that, notice that only the top left is rounded. Okay, so we can choose which corners we want to round. And let's say we just want the whole top, so we'll just copy this down and we'll do right as well. All right, so now if we look at that, both of the top is rounded. Now you don't even have to have a border property to use border radius. Like, we could still round the bottom edges even though there's no border. Okay, so that doesn't matter. So next thing I want to look at is the background image property. Okay, a lot of times you might want to have some kind of image as your background. So let's use box 3, and let's use the background dash image property. So this is going to actually take in URL, and in here we could use a remote image, like we could do HTTP and then locate some image on the internet and use that. But what we want to do is target the stars.jpg file that's in our image folder. Okay, and since our image folder is local in our directory here, we can just do /, that represents the current directory. Then we want to go into the image directory, and then we want to call the stars.jpg file. Okay, so let's save that, and let's go back, and notice that it uses the background image. Now you don't see the whole image because it only takes up the space of the actual element. Okay, and this is the whole div right here. Now we can make this bigger by setting a height. We can set a height and a width in CSS. Let's also change the color of the text because it's unreadable right now. So we'll say color white, and let's give it a height of, let's say, 300 pixels, and let's give it a width of 600 pixels. And let's save that and take a look, and there we go. So now we have our background image. We have a width of 300 and a height of, width of 600 and a height of 300. So with background image, or I should say with background, you have a bunch of other properties, just like with border. One of those is background repeat. Now you can't see it here, but let's say this image was only like this big. Okay, it ended right here. It would repeat both this way on the x-axis and this way on the y-axis. And usually you're not going to want that unless it's some kind of seamless texture that you want to repeat, like as some kind of seamless background. But for the most part, you're not going to want that. So let's go ahead and set the background dash repeat property. And there's a few options here. You can do repeat, which is the default. It repeats both ways. Repeat X will only repeat on the X-axis, which is horizontal. Repeat Y will go on the up and down, the Y-axis. But what we want is no repeat because we don't want it to repeat. Okay. Another property is the position property. So let's say background position, and this will move the image around. It takes in two values. The first is going to be the x-axis and the second is the y-axis. So let's do 100 pixels. Let's just do 100 pixels 0 and see what happens here. So what happened is on the x-axis it pushed it over 100 pixels and it actually leaves a blank space here. Now if I do 100 pixels on the y-axis, try to guess what's going to happen. So let's save that and take a look, and it pushes it down 100 pixels. Now let's say you wanted to move it up and over 100 pixels so that the image didn't actually get pushed out of its context here, or its wrapper. So let's go back, and what we can do is we can do negative values. So now if we take a look, what happened is the image went up 100 pixels and over this way 100 pixels. Now you also have keywords you can use like top, center, and bottom. So let's say we wanted to center and center on both axes. Okay, and you can see what it did is it just centered it. If I wanted to take the y-axis and move it up to the top, we could do that as well. And this might not be the best image to use as an example because it's just stars. It's not something that you can actually tell what position it's in, but just know that we can move it, you know, top, bottom, center, and so on. Now, in most cases, you're going to want the whole image to cover the background, and that's not what's going on here. It's the size of the image, which I believe is 1920 by 1080, so the image is really like this big. It's like the whole window. Now let's say we just want the whole image to show in this spot. What we could do is we could add a background size property, and we can set that to cover. Okay, so it's going to cover the whole space. So if we take a look now, the whole image is showing. It doesn't matter what size the image is. It's going to take up the whole space right here. All right, so that's a lot of different properties, right, for the background. There's even more than that, but let's say that we want to do exactly what we're doing here, but we don't want to take up all these lines with all these different properties. We can actually just use background. Okay, so I'm going to use background. I'm going to do the same exact thing we just did. So we're going to take the URL, and then after that we want the no repeat, and then after that we'll do the position. Let's do center. Let's just do center, center, and then when you want to put the size in, you just do a slash and then cover like that. So if I go ahead and comment this out and save and take a look, we get the same result with much less lines of code, much less properties. Okay, so let's move on. I want to look at having a fixed background, and I'll show you what I mean. So let's add in our box 4, and this time I'm going to set background. Now when you want to set an image, you don't have to use background image. You can use just background, even if you don't want to add all this other stuff we did up here. So let's do URL. And let's go in the current folder and then into the image folder, and we want leaf.png. Okay, and I'm just going to do a no repeat. All right. Now let's save this and see what we get. So notice that it's just because the image is bigger, like the image is this big, it's not going to show the whole image. It's only going to cover whatever the content area covers, which is this right here. So let's see. What I'm going to do is set. Actually, you know what we'll do is we'll add more content. So in box 4, let's take this paragraph and let's just copy it down like a bunch of times, a lot, and save that. And now take a look. And now notice that it shows the whole image because the content area is bigger. If we manually set a height like we did here, we'd be able to see the whole image as well. But I want to show you how we can make this a fixed image. And to give you an example, let me just make this smaller so we have more of a scroll. Now if I scroll, see how the image just kind of stays in place? We can make it fixed. So let's go back up to box 4. And let's actually position it differently too. So let's do center, bottom, Let's see what that looks like. So now it's, see how it's center bottom? Let's do center center. Okay, so now it's dead center. Now I want it to stay fixed, so I'm going to add a background attached. I'm sorry, background attachment property. And let's say fixed. And let's save that. And now watch when I scroll. The image just stays in place, and it's fixed to the browser window. Okay, so if you want to do that, then you want to use the background attachment fixed. Alright, so that's going to be it for this video, guys. In the next one, we're going to start to talk about the box model, which has to do with margin and padding and just how spacing works in CSS. Alright, so in this video we're going to talk about the box model, and we're going to talk about margin and padding, as well as what a CSS reset is. Okay, we're also going to look at some of the default styling of the browser. So let's create a new file here called 06_box_model.html. And let's put in our head body tags, and for the title we'll say box model, margin and padding. And let's put in our style, and then for the HTML I'm going to put in a div with the class of box, which is just going to have an h3, we'll say box1, and then a paragraph with 20 words, so lorem 20. Alright, and then I'm just going to copy this down, so Shift Option or Shift Alt and then down, we'll copy it. And let's just we'll just change this to box2, and they both have the same class, okay, which is absolutely fine. We're just going to style them the same way. So let's save this and open it with Live Server, open it in Chrome, and I want to open up our dev tools. So on Mac it's Command Option I, on Windows it's F12, or you can use your menu. So remember, this is the HTML over here, this is the CSS. So I'm actually going to just click on the div right here, the first div, which will give us the CSS, which by default just has a display block, because remember, divs by default are displayed as a block, meaning they go all the way across. And right here you're going to see a diagram of the box model, which makes it a lot easier to explain. So there's basically 4 layers. There's the element itself, which we can put a height and a width property on. By default, the width is all the way across, and the height is going to be however much content is in it. If I add a bunch more paragraphs, it's going to extend more. Or I can just set a height in CSS. Then we have padding, so we have spacing we can put here. Then we have the border. Okay, we looked at the border properties in the last video. And then we have the margin. Now, the margin and padding, the spacing, is, some people get this confused when they first start, but all you really have to remember is the margin is the outside of the element or the outside of the border, the padding is the inside. Okay, so to give you an example, let me just add some styling for the box. Okay, so we're going to say box, and we're going to say background. We're going to give it a color of light gray. Okay, and then we'll give it a border. Let's say 2 pixels, gray, solid. And we went over this stuff in the last video. So now you can get a better picture of the box model. So we have the content, then we have the padding, and then we have the border, and then outside of the border is the margin. Now, notice that there's some spacing here, there's spacing here, there's spacing here. And there's even spacing around the sides. That's because the browser has default margin and padding on certain elements. So if we grab the selector tool here and I hover over the H3, you'll see that there's some orange areas here where the space is. That's the margin. And if I go over the paragraph, we have some margin, and even the body. If I go right, actually it's not going to let me show it. But anyways, the body has some margin as well. So let's click on this, the H3, and then over here you'll see the styling. So this margin block start, margin block end is basically margin top and bottom. and it has a value of 1m, and m is a relative unit. It's relative to the number of pixels of the font size of its element, of its parent container. And if you don't understand what that means, don't worry about it. If you want to see the computed pixels, you can actually click on computed, and it'll show you that the font size and the margin on the top and bottom for the H3 is going to be, it's 1872 pixels by default. If we click on the paragraph, you'll see that it has a margin on the top and bottom of 16 pixels. If I click on the body, you can see it has a margin on all sides of 8 pixels. And there you can see the orange around the whole body. Okay, so these are all default browser styles. And there's other elements as well, like a UL, an unordered list, and an ordered list. They both have margin on the top and bottom, and they have a padding on the left of, I believe, 40 pixels. So this is just stuff that you're going to run into, and you can overwrite those values, obviously. Like I could set, for paragraph, I could set margin to 0 and get rid of that. And I can actually show you that real quick. So if I say box paragraph and set margin to 0 and save that, we go back. Now you'll see that there's no orange when I hover over the paragraph. And if we look at the styles, you can still see the default, but this overwrites it, what I just did. Okay, now if you want to take away all the default styling, you can do that with what's called a reset. So I'm going to get rid of that, what I just did, and I'm going to create a CSS reset. Okay, and there's different ways to reset. You can reset margin and padding, font size, borders. There's actually like popular reset files that you can use, like Eric Myers has a reset file that's pretty popular, but the easiest way to do it is just to use an asterisk, which selects everything, and then just say you want margin to be 0 and padding to be 0. Okay, so we're just setting the margin and padding to 0 for everything. So let's save that, and this is on all sides. Okay, top, bottom, left, and right. So if we go back now, notice there's no spacing anywhere, not even on the body, not even on the side here. And if I grab the selector tool, there's no orange, there's no green, which is padding. There's just no spacing at all. Now, it's up to you on if you want to use a reset or not. I do sometimes. It really depends on the layout. But if you do use it, you have to remember to add all of your own margin and padding, because now if I add another paragraph under this one, it's going to be right next to it. It's not going to have that default spacing that the browser gives it. Same with the heading. Usually you'll want some space here. It's not there anymore. We will have to create it if we're going to keep the reset. All right, so I just wanted to kind of explain how the default margin and padding works, also the structure of the box model. So now let's look at some properties that have to do with margin and padding. So I'm going to add a width to the box as well. Let's do width 500 pixels. And let's say I want padding on all sides. So I'm going to put a comment right here, and I'm going to say padding on all sides. So we would just use padding, and then we could do, let's say, 20 pixels. So this will put 20 pixels on all sides. You can see top, and notice the green. If I use the element selector and we hover over it, we see the green. That's actually the padding. Okay, and you can see that it's 20 pixels on all sides for both, obviously, because they both have the class of box, which is what we styled. Now, when we add padding, if we keep the box sizing the way it is now, the box sizing property, it adds to the width of the entire thing. All right, and to just give you an example, if I say padding 120 and we take a look, the width of this is it's not 500 pixels. It added to that. It's 500 pixels plus the padding, and that's not usually how you want to do it. Usually you want to keep the width at the right width and then just add the padding. So to do that, you want to add to the asterisk right here a box sizing property. Okay, and you want to set that to border box. So now if I save that and we go back, we still have 120 pixels padding, but the box is still 500 pixels. It just pushes it inside, okay, as opposed to adding it. So let's put that back to 20. I just made it that big so you could tell that the width was larger. So we'll put that back. And the next thing I want to do is show you margin, because right now there's no margin and these are kind of stuck together. So margin is going to be spacing around the border, on the outside of the border. So let's add, let's say margin on all sides, and we'll say margin 20 pixels. And if we take a look and we use our element selector, see the orange, that's the margin. The green is the padding, the orange is the margin. In fact, if I click on one of the divs and we look at the box model, it'll show us all the values. 20, the border is 2 pixels, the padding is 20, and then the width here. Okay, so just remember that, margin outside, padding inside. And it doesn't matter if you have a border property set or not, it's still going to be relative to the box model. All right, now these properties that we've used, padding and margin with just one value, it's putting the same on all sides, but there may be cases where you want different values on different sides. So I'm going to go down here and let's say padding per side. Okay, so we can use padding top. So let's say on the top we want 10 pixels. And let's do padding bottom. Actually, I'm going to do top, let's do right, and I'm doing this in a certain order for a reason, and I'll show you that in a minute. So padding right, let's say we want 20 pixels. Let's do padding bottom, we'll do 10 just like the top, and then left, we'll do 20 just like the right. Okay, now this is going to overwrite this, and that's something that I really haven't talked about yet. When you have the same properties, the ones that are further down are going to overwrite the ones that are further up. Okay, so all this padding here is going to overwrite this one. So even if I leave them without commenting this out, this is going to take effect. So let's take a look, and you can see now there's less padding. If you look at the green, there's 10 pixels on the top and bottom, there's 20 on the left and right. So if you want to do this, but you don't want to have 4 different properties, you can shorten this, just like with most cases, like you saw with the border and the background, there's shorthands. So let's say padding shorthand. Now, when we do this, there's a certain order to the values. So it's going to be this, just like I did right above, top, right, bottom, left. That's why I did it in this order. So if we say padding, it's going to be in that order. So let's do top 10 pixels, right 20 pixels, bottom 10 pixels, left 20 pixels. So if I save that and we take a look, it's going to be the same thing. So this is just a shorthand for this. It does the exact same thing. Now we can make this even shorter because the top and bottom and the left and right are the same. Top and bottom are 10, left and right are 20. So let's say padding shorthand. So we can actually just have 2 values. One will be top, bottom. One will be left, right. So we'll say padding. Top and bottom we want 10, left and right we want 20. Okay, so this is the same exact thing as this, which is the same exact thing as this. So we're just shortening it up. Okay, so if we look at it, we get the same exact thing. We have the 10 on the top and bottom, 20 on the left and right. So hopefully that makes sense. You can add padding all these different ways. Now with margin, it's the same exact thing. Okay, same exact thing. I'm actually going to just copy all this and change it to margin. So margin top, right, left, bottom. This same thing, same order. So let's grab this and let's put this down here and just change this to margin. Change these to margin. Margin. Okay, so that's going to do the same exact thing. Let's save that. If we take a look, now we have 10 pixels top and bottom margin, 20 left and right margin. Okay, so yeah, I think that's all I want to do here. One other thing, usually since we did a reset, we'd probably want to separate the H3 and the paragraph a little bit. So what I would do is just add box H3, and I'd probably add like padding bottom 10 pixels, 5 pixels, whatever it may be. Whoops, what happened here? Oh, I'm inside. I'm inside this style. Okay, so let's check that out, and now we have spacing under the heading. All right, so that's it, guys. In the next video, we're going to start to talk about floats. Okay, so we can align things. Now, ultimately, when you align stuff, you're usually going to want to use Flexbox or the CSS grid, but we're not going to talk about that stuff just yet because that stuff is a little more complicated and it's much newer. I want you to get a handle on just old-fashioned floating before you start to deal with flex and grid and stuff like that. All right, so I'll see you in the next video. All right, guys, in this video, we're going to look at aligning elements. We're going to look at aligning text, and we're going to look at auto margin. So let's create a new file here called 07, and I'm just going to call this float_align.html. And let's throw in our tags here, head body tags, and we'll say float and align. Style. Okay, and all I want here is 3 divs with the class of box, but I want them to have separate IDs so that we can target them separately as well. Now with Emmet, I don't think I showed you this. If we want to add an ID and a class, we can do like ID box1 class box. Okay, we can do that. And then I'm just going to put an H3 in here, and I'm just going to say heading, doesn't really matter. And then we'll do lorem 20. Okay, and we're going to copy this down 2 more times and just change the ID to 2 and then 3. Okay, so we'll save that, and let's open this with Live Server. Okay, now first thing I want to show you is how to center your content or your layout, because in just about all cases, every website you go to, it's in the center. It's not over to the left like this. Maybe in like the 90s or early 2000s it was, but now your stuff is going to be in the middle. So to do that is pretty easy. We just need to have a container class or ID or container element, I should say, and then we need to add a width to it and set the margin to auto. Okay, if we set the margin to auto, it's going to add the same amount of margin on both sides, pushing it into the middle. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to wrap this in a class called container. Okay, you'll see the class name container often, container or wrap or wrapper, and then we're going to grab everything here and put it inside the container. Okay, let me just fix this up a little bit. All right, so up here in our CSS, let's do container. And let's set a width of, now it's up to you how wide you want your layout to be. I'm going to do 960, which is kind of narrow. And then actually we'll just do that for now. And if we go back to our if we go back to our content and I open up our Chrome tools and take a look, you'll see that we want to go to the container. You'll see that the blue, it ends at 960 pixels. Okay, that's 960 wide. Now to move it to the middle is very simple. All we have to do is add in margin auto. If I save that, we go back, now you'll see it's in the middle. Okay, and the orange part on the sides is the margin. Okay, and notice it's the same. It's even on both sides. That's what happens if you do margin auto. Now, if you want to move it down a little bit, if you want margin on the top and bottom, you could do something like this. You could say 30 pixels for top and bottom, auto on the left and right. And now, if I hover over it, you'll see that there's 30 on the top and bottom. Okay, now there's an issue with using just width in this case. So let me show you that. It has to do with responsive design. You want to do all you can to make your site look decent on mobile devices, and we're going to get more into this later. But if I go down like this, like if we were to view this on a mobile device, you can't even read the text. You have this scroll bar, which is just horrible. We want all the text to display here. So to fix that is very simple. All we have to do is go from width to using max width. So if I save that and we go back, now all the text is there, okay, regardless of the screen size. And then once I get to 960, it's gonna stop. That's the boundary because we set a max width of 960. Okay, so you should always use max width on your containers. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is just kind of style these boxes a little bit and the body. I'm just going to throw in a body style of, let's do font. Let's do font family, Arial, Helvetica Sans Serif, and then I'm just going to add a line height of 1.4 rem or m. And let's see. Let's style the box class a little bit. So for box, we'll do background light gray and border 1 pixel solid dark gray, padding 20 pixels, and let's do margin bottom 15 pixels. All right, so let's take a look at that. So all of our boxes now have 20 pixels padding. They have the border, the background, and some margin to push the other ones down. So before we get into floating, I just want to look at the text align property, and that's what text align is used for. It's just text. It's not used to align boxes and stuff. So let's just target the paragraph in here. So I'm gonna say box, and then we want to grab the paragraphs within the box. Let's put a comment here saying this is for the text align property. So by default, it's aligned to the left. If I do that, it's just going to stay how it is. But let's say we wanted it aligned to the right. Whoops, we want to do text align right. And if we look at that, now the text is aligned to the right. If we want it to the center, we could do center, and it's just overwriting. I can leave these, whatever the last one is, that's going to overwrite the other ones. So now center, okay, so that was center, and that text align center is used often, and I could put text align center on the div if I wanted this, and if I wanted everything within it to be centered as well. And then we could also do justify. So justify will just make the edges all even. You can't really tell here because there's not much text, but if I make this smaller, see how it's all even on the edge? So that's justify. I'm sure you guys have used justify in like Microsoft Word or something. All right, so now I want to talk about floating. And I just want to explain something real quick. So I'm going to just do a search for HTML layout example. Go to images. Let's see. Let's look at this old Bootstrap layout. So over here we have a sidebar, and then we have a main area. Okay, so these are aligned horizontally. And then inside the main area we have some boxes that are also aligned horizontally. Now we can do this with floats, and that's what we're working on right now. But that's not the way that you should do it now, okay, these days. Because now we have Flexbox that's built into CSS. We also have CSS Grid. And to use those, we use the display property. We can say display flex or display grid. And then we have some other properties that are associated with it. And this is the way that you should do this stuff these days. A couple years ago, we would have to use floats. And floats are much more of a pain in the neck because you have to clear them. It's more of a pain dealing with responsive design, dealing with mobile devices and stuff like that. So it's not ideal anymore. But with that said, I still want you guys to know how to use floats. In fact, the project that we're going to do next, the hotel website, we are going to use floats because I don't want to get into Flex or the grid just yet. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Just keep in mind that we're learning floats, but it's not something that you're going to use that much, or that you should use that much. So let's say that we want to take box 2 and 3. We want box 2 to float to the left, come to about here or so. We want box 3 to be kind of a sidebar, a more narrow box. So let's do that. Let's jump in and let's target box 2, which has an ID of box 2. And let's say float to the left. Now if we do just that, it doesn't do much. You'll see that it's kind of put up right on top of box 3, but you want to add a width when you're floating something. So let's say width, and I could use pixels, but it gets kind of messy. You're probably going to want to use percentages. Now the container that the boxes are in is 960 pixels, okay, max width. So what we can do is let's use a percentage of 70%, and then we'll take box 3 and let's float that to the right, and let's say we want the width to be 30%, okay, because obviously 70 and 30 is 100% of its container. So let's see what that looks like. We'll save it, we'll go back, and we have an issue. It's not fitting. Now the reason for that is because we didn't set the border box property. Remember in the last video I showed you that when you add padding, which both of these have, it adds to the width. Okay, so this is another pain in the neck for floating. It adds to the width, so we have to actually add a box sizing property on the asterisk. Okay, well we don't have to put it on the asterisk, but I always do just because I want all elements. I want this applied to everything. So let's say box sizing, we want to set to border box. So once I do that, it takes away that, it doesn't add the padding to the actual widths. So now it fits. But they're right on top of each other. So what I would do in this situation is probably just lessen the percentage. So instead of 70 for box 2, let's change it to 68 so it doesn't go all the way over. And there we go. All right, now this isn't going to look right if we make this smaller, but we're not going to get into that yet. We're not going to get into responsiveness yet. The website, the hotel website we build, we will be using media queries and stuff to make it responsive. So, I mean, this is how we would do it before Flex and CSS Grid came out. Now, I just want to show you guys that if we add another div below this, and we'll just call this box 4. Okay, so remember 2 and 3 are floated, and then box 4 is under it. So let's see what that looks like. Doesn't look right. So it's basically put behind it. It doesn't push it down under the floated elements because the floated elements have to be cleared. This is another pain in the neck when it comes to floating. So what we would do, or one thing we could do, is add a class, a utility class. I'm going to put it up here. I'll call it CLR for clear, and we'll set the clear property to both because we want to clear the left and right floats that we just created. And then we would have to put it right under where the float is, which is under 2 and 3. Okay, so div class clear. Now, if we go back, box 4 is pushed down. Okay, so remember, if you use floating, you're going to have to clear them in most cases. Now, another area that floating is used is in navigation bars. A lot of time you'll see the horizontal navigations. So in the next video, we're going to look at styling links and buttons, and we're also going to look at creating a basic navigation bar where we float the list items. All right, so I'll see you in the next video. All right, in this video, we're going to look at links, styling links, and buttons. And links are kind of special because they have different states. You have your regular links, your regular state, you have your hover state, an active state, and a visited state. And you can actually style those different states using something called a pseudo selector. And I'm also going to show you how to style buttons, and also how to style a link as a button, because a lot of times you'll have actual A tags that you want to look like buttons in your website or your user interface. So let's go ahead and create a new file here called 08_links_buttons.html. And we're going to go ahead and change the title up to links and buttons. Okay, and let's add our style. And for now, we'll just put in an A tag. Doesn't matter where it goes, and just say click here and save. Let's open it up with Live Server, and we just have a simple link, and it's going to be blue by default with an underline, which doesn't look very good. So I'm going to grab onto that A tag here, use that as a selector, and I'm going to change the color to a dark gray. And then to remove the underline, we want to use the text decoration property, and we want to set that to none. Okay, so the default is underline, but we're going to set it to none. Now, if I hover over it, you'll see we get a cursor. The cursor changes into a pointer, but nothing else changes. So you're probably going to want some kind of change when you hover over it. Now, to do that, we can use the pseudo selector hover. So we can do A:, and then hover. And let's change the color to coral. So now if I go and I hover over it, it changes to coral. And you can add any properties you want here. You could do something crazy like let's do font size, changes to like 40 pixels. And now when I hover over it, it goes to 40 pixels font size. So you can do whatever you want in the hover state, but I'm not going to keep that. Let's just change the color. And if you want to add the underline on hover, you could do text decoration underline, and now you can see that it's colored and it's underlined. So in addition to hover, we have visited. So we can do A:visited, and let's just do color red. Now, visited, at least for me, I don't use this very much. I don't think I've ever used it actually in a real project. When you click on it and you visit it, it then turns red, and it stays red. Even if I reload the server, it stays red. And if there were other links, if we didn't click on them, they'd be gray, dark gray. And then you'd click on it and they turn red. So it's kind of weird. And I really don't like it, and it's not something that I use, but it is possible. So I just wanted to show you that, but I'm going to comment that out. Another state that we have for links is active. So if we do A:active, and let's say color red, and now the active state is going to be when we click. So when I click, see how it turns red? And if I click and hold, it also turns red. So that's the active state, and that's another one that I really don't use, but it is possible. So those are the different states for links. Now what I want to do is I want to style. I'm going to put a button in here and style the link and the button the same way. So let's say button, and let's give both of these a class of BTN. Okay, so this is often what I'll do in projects, is I'll have different button classes. Sometimes I'll have like a BTN light if I want a light button, BTN dark, which will be basically the same, just different colors. But let's just do BTN. We'll say click here. Actually, you know what? Let's put in the text my button, just so we know that this is a button. And then up here, let's say my link, and save, and you can see that they're obviously formatted very differently initially, but we want to make them the same, and I'm going to just make this bigger. Not that big. Okay, so we have a link and a button. Let's see, I want these on separate lines. They're both inline elements, so I'm going to just put a couple line breaks here just to kind of get them away from each other. So buttons obviously are styled differently. They have a border, they have a little bit of padding here, the font's different. So let's go up here into our styling, and let's say button styling. So we have a class of btn, and let's go ahead and add a background. And I'm going to use a blue that's like a Facebook brand blue. So it's going to be 4C 6C A0. And let's set the color of the text to white. Okay, let's save that and see what we get. All right. Now we want to remove the border because buttons have borders. So we're going to say border. We could either do border none like that, or we could do border 0. I usually use border none. So we'll save that. Now the border is off the actual button. Next thing we want to do is the font size. Okay, we want the font size to be the same for all links in buttons, which we're going to set to 16 pixels. So we'll save that. Good. Next thing we'll do is the padding. So let's say we want to do 10 on the top and bottom and 20 left and right. Save that. And this is zoomed in. That's why this is so big. Can actually zoom out a little bit now. Yeah, and let's change the font for the body. So I'm going to say font family. Let's grab this. Where is it? Tahoma Sigu UI Tahoma. Okay, that looks a little better. Back down to our button. Let's give it a little border radius. Okay, and these are all properties that we've learned about. So we're kind of taking all the stuff that we've learned and actually creating an element that's styled. Okay, so now you can see they have the rounded corners. Let's actually put a line break above the A tag too, just to bring it down a little bit. All right, so these are pretty much identical now. So for any button or any link that we want to style this way, we would just add the class btn, okay, globally. Now, one thing that I want to mention is we'll go over this in a minute, how the hover state. But when we go over the actual button, we don't get a cursor. We don't get a pointer on our cursor. And for this, we do. Okay, links by default, you do get the pointer. So if we want the pointer to show up either way, we can actually set that in the CSS. So we can set cursor pointer, and now when I go over the button, you can see that it turns into a pointer. Now for the hover state. So let's say btn hover. Oops, we don't want a space there. That won't work. So btn hover, and we're going to set the color to, let's do a light gray. So that's the text color, and then the background, I'm going to set that to just a slightly lighter blue than the one we have, which is going to be 446190. Okay, or is it darker? I think it's darker. And then I'm going to just get rid of the text decoration underline for the link up here. Even though we said link hovers should be coral, down here we're saying the button hover should be light gray, and this is going to overwrite that style. So let's save. Let's go ahead and hover, and you can see that the blue gets a little darker. So you can't even distinguish the difference here between the link, the A tag, and the button tag, and that's what we want. So that's what you're going to do a lot in websites, and especially in user interfaces where you have a lot of links that you want to format as buttons. All right, so that's it, guys. In the next video, what I want to do is start to look at menus, creating vertical and horizontal navigation bars. So we'll get into that next.